Ethics, derived from the Greek word ethos, meaning custom or habit, is concerned with questions of how people ought to act, the search for a definition of right conduct. Ethics differs from morals and morality in that ethics denotes the theory of right action and the greater good. While morals indicate their practice, ethics is not limited to specific acts and defined moral codes, but encompasses the whole of moral ideals and behaviors, a person's philosophy of life. It asks questions like, how should people act? Normative ethics. What do people think is right? Descriptive ethics. And what does right even mean? Metaethics. Normative ethics. Form of inquiry that attempts to answer the question, which norms for the evaluation of conduct should we accept and why? It decides how people ought to act, how moral choices should be made, and how the rules apply. It branches into practical ethics, use of theory, arguments, and analysis. A normative approach assumes the universality of its ethical principles and attempts to justify them on a rational basis. Christian ethics is a classic example of normative ethics. The most famous example of normative ethics is found in the Ten Commandments. Normative ethical claims: murder is wrong, telling the truth is good. Descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics is a value-free approach to ethics. The category of descriptive ethics is the easiest to understand. It simply involves describing how people behave and or what sorts of moral standards they claim to follow. Descriptive ethics incorporates research from the field of anthropology, psychology, sociology, and history as part of the process of understanding what the people do or have believe about moral norms. Descriptive ethic claims: where can one evade an uncomfortable truth without doing wrong? Different societies have different moral standards. In the book of Stephen D. Hales, This is Philosophy, an Introduction, he considers whether acting morally is equivalent to acting out principles. It covers background ethical issues and theories. He begins with a discussion of normative terms like should and how the moral uses of should differ from prudential or legal uses of it, using Osama bin Laden as a counterexample to that claim. He then discusses the divine command theory, complete with a compulsory discussion of the Euthyphro problem. His conclusion is that we can investigate ethics without debating religion. Now let's go back to this guy. Bin Laden is clearly concerned with the morality of killing. He takes pains to note that Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center, a financial building that in his view contained supporters of a materialist, imperialist nation of unbelievers. Bin Laden cites religious scholars and interpreters of the Quran to support his belief that killing non-combatants as a form of deterrence is a morally permissible act, sanctioned by his religion. If you think that he was wicked, mass-murdering evildoer, it is not because he failed to be principled, it is because you find his principles to be the bad ones. What proof is there that Bin Laden's moral principles are the wrong ones? None really, other than an appeal to our common ethical intuitions that the intentional murder of innocents to further some idiosyncratic, political, or religious goal is morally heinous. Just because we base our actions on some rule, principle, or moral code that we've adopted or created is no guarantee that we'll do the right thing. We could have a bad moral code. Well, is it better to base your actions on your intuitions, on the feelings you have about whatever situation is at hand? Not necessarily. Feelings are immediate and case specific. Your gut instincts may lead you to choose short term benefits over what's best in the long term. For example, imagine a mother who has taken a toddler in for a vaccination. The child is crying, not wanting to feel the pain of the needle. Surely the mother's instincts are to whisk the child away from the doctor advancing with his sharp pointy stick. Yet, sometimes the right action is to set our feelings aside to see the larger picture. The mother has a moral obligation to care for her child, and so must hold back her protective sympathies and force the child to get the shot. We modify our moral views in light of compelling arguments and counterexamples, or sometimes go back to the drawing board altogether to come up with a better theories. Now let us look at the oldest and most widely held ethical theory in the world. It is the divine command theory. The divine command theory is the view that morality is somehow dependent upon their God, and that moral obligation consists in obedience to that God's commands. The claim that morality is ultimately based on the commands or character of God. The moral right action is the one that God's commands and require. Divine command theory is not new, nor it is connected with any particular religion. The need for God as a source of morality is often cited as a motivation. Maybe the motivation to be religious, that the ethical life is possible only within a religious context. It is endorsed, as we saw in the last clips, by Osama bin Laden and promoted by no end of Christian ministers, pundits, and politicians. The proposal that morality is essentially connected to religion has two chief components. 1. God loves, endorses, recommends, advocates all good actions and hates, forbids, adjures, prohibits all evil actions. 2. We can figure out which is which. That is, we can know what God loves and what He hates. But this poses a lot of criticisms. For example, here is a morally perfect God, that is, there is a God, who loves everything good and hates everything evil. And perfectly good God is that the attitudes are in perfect sync with morality. As Plato, not an atheist, discussed the idea that morality and religion are inseparable 2,500 years ago in his dialogue Euthyphro. Nevertheless, Plato taught that, even if the gods are perfectly good, that the fact is not enough to explain morality. In Euthyphro, he raises this very subtle and interesting question. Are things good because God loved them? Or does he love them because they are good? This might not sound like much of distinction at first. The question presents two very different options about God's love. Philosophers metaphorize this dilemma as to holding an angry bull by the horns. So the two options are known as the bull's horns. First horn, proposition that the right acts are right because God commands them. If God determines the rightness and wrongness of everything just by saying so, then the entire concept of goodness and value becomes void. The idea of what's good doesn't really mean anything anymore. Second horn, does it make sense to say that God's command things because they are good? It means that God isn't omnipotent, because there's at least one thing, value that doesn't stem from God. If there's some standard of goodness that God has to stick to when making commandments, then that means that there must be things that God cannot command. Whichever horn you choose, it presents serious problems for the divine command theories. Either God is bound by a standard outside of himself, or God's goodness doesn't really mean anything. If Plato is right, and morality and religion are logically independent, then we can investigate ethics without debating religion. Perhaps the smart practical move is to do that very thing.